Hello, everyone. Great to see so many people here. My name is Robin Tress. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Organizing at the Council of Canadians, and I'm glad to see you all here. I'm seeing lots of people still joining. We've got almost 400 people with us tonight, which is fantastic. So I think that we can get started. I hope that you enjoyed our musical introduction. Um, like I said, my name's Robin. I'm joining this conversation from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And as I'm sure all of you are joining from many various Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit lands that are currently occupied by Canada. As we enter this conversation tonight, I find it really helpful to start from a recognition of the physical lands that we're on. All of the economic and social hardships and structures that we'll discuss happen on occupied Indigenous lands. And as people who are here tonight to contribute to a brighter way forward, I find it useful to remember the extraordinarily sophisticated knowledge that Indigenous nations have been cultivating about how to live here and how to care about living things here. So I want to share my gratitude for the many Mi'kmaq women and grandmothers who have shared so much wisdom and patience with me over the years. I found that learning about the many and diverse ways that Indigenous nations have lived and continue to live, and the way they've organized and continue to organize their communities and society, really gives me a lot of hope that there's another way to live together well, other than the way we do currently right now. So I'm really glad that you could join us tonight for our webinar titled The Many Can Defeat the Money. As I'm sure many of you have experienced, things in general are not very good right now. Every trip to the grocery store leaves me with sticker shock. I find every day I hear stories from people about not having a family doctor or not being able to get in to see their doctors for weeks on end if they do have one. Things are either on fire or underwater, literally. Thinking of Vancouver this week and hoping everyone out there is doing all right. We know rents are going up. We know all of these things, and they are truly untenable. And so while these crises injure us every day, more and more people are really alive to the idea that corporate greed is at the root of these problems. People are angry about corporate greed, and rightly so. But we also know it doesn't have to be this way. So while the rest of us experience this real economic slowdown, corporate profits have grown during the COVID years and continue to remain extraordinarily high. But we know we don't need to fight each other for scraps because there is truly enough to go around. As social movements in Canada, we have a really big job ahead of us, which is to make sure that those resources that corporations are currently hoarding are moved into our communities rather than out of them, so that we can strengthen our collective well-being rather than prioritizing private profit. I hope the Council of Canadians is not new to you, but if it is, welcome. We're glad to see you. The Council's been around since 1985, organizing to protect things that we hold in common, like healthcare, water, our environment, and democracy. We've seen corporate power attacking all of these things at every turn for decades, and we've been part of incredible movements working to defend them. And now, while public ire about corporate greed is at its highest that I've ever seen in my life, quite perversely, we're seeing some of Canada's most corporate-friendly politicians subvert this wave of rage that people are feeling about the state of the world and the state of corporate power and ride that wave of rage straight to the top of the polls. So I'm speaking, of course, of Pierre Poilievre as well as several provincial governments. These governments and politicians are doing an unfortunately effective job of relating to people's anger and turning it into political support without actually offering anything resembling a solution to the problems created by corporate greed. So we know as our movements, we need to present some real solutions to these crises of the moment we're in. And we need to organize quite powerfully to win the changes that we want to see. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So I'm really glad that we've gathered all together and that we've got some great panelists who are going to offer some fresh analysis and new inspiration and to start building that powerful organizing that we need. So here's how the discussion tonight will work. We'll have a moderated conversation with our panel for about 45 minutes. During this time, you'll find that the chat function will be closed, so because it's quite distracting for the people speaking, but we'll open the chat again during the question and answer section, which will follow the panel discussion, and you're welcome to contribute to the conversation there. If you would like to ask a question to the panel, those questions can be submitted at any time through the whole webinar through the question and answer function, which you'll see on the bottom bar of your screen on Zoom. Please don't put any questions that you want to direct towards the panel into the chat. It's just quite hard for us to find them later. So we'll only be getting to questions for the speakers that come through the Q&A function. So we can pass them along to our host. We'll assume that any questions that you pose in the chat are just intended for conversational purposes with other participants, and that's excellent, and we encourage that. We'll have a couple of polls, so a few questions to ask you towards the end of the evening to see what you think about what's being discussed and what you're motivated to do. So we hope you'll stick around right until the end so you can hear, participate in those polls, hear about how to join the Council of Canadians and get involved in our work. And at the very end, we'll share a survey after the webinar so that we'll hear from you about what you thought about the discussion and what we can all do next. So that's how tonight will go. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the panel. So I'll introduce our host for the evening, Anjali Appadurai. Anjali is a climate justice organizer and campaigner. She got her start in youth organizing movements around the world to ensure that global South social movements' demands are heard in the halls of power. Today, she is the campaigns director at the Climate Emergency Unit and runs the Padma Center for Climate Justice, which is a project that brings together diaspora communities to build power around issues of climate and economic justice. Anjali has also engaged with the electoral system, running as an NDP candidate in 2021 and as the BC in the BC leadership race in 2022. So we're so happy to have you, Anjali. Thank you so much for hosting us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you and the rest of the panel.
Thanks so much for that lovely intro, Robin. Hi, everyone. My name is Anjali. I am calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on Coast Salish lands, also known as Vancouver. Very, very happy to be here and absolutely thrilled to be able to have this conversation with these brilliant folks who are doing so much to tackle what all of us are feeling in this collective moment. So I want to start by introducing our speakers for tonight. I'm going to start with Laura. So Laura Walton is the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, Canada's largest provincial labour federation. She previously served as the president of the OSBCU, the union representing education workers in Ontario. There she oversaw an unprecedented organizing drive that empowered more than 55,000 workers to strike for a better deal, and then to successfully defeat Premier Doug Ford's attempts to suppress their right to go on strike. Laura is proud of her rural roots growing up in Belleville, Ontario, and she joins us today from Toronto. So welcome, Laura. So great to have you. So excited to have this conversation. All right, I'm going to introduce Judy Rebick. Judy is a well-known activist, writer, journalist, and educator. She's the author of many books, including her memoir, The Heroes in My Head, and Transforming Power from the Personal to the Political. She's also founding publisher of Rabble, the independent online news media outlet. Judy came to national prominence in the 1980s as a spokesperson for the pro-choice movement during the fight to legalize abortion. In the 1990s, she served as president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, Canada's largest women's group. She's hosted 2 national TV shows on CBC and has been a frequent commentator since on radio and television. She also lives in Toronto. Welcome, Judy. Oh, you're muted, but that's okay.
Thank you. Nice to be here is all I said.
Lovely. Syed Hussan is the co-founder and executive director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, the largest membership-based organization in Canada that unites tens of thousands of migrants, ranging from farm work and care work to international students and undocumented people. Hussan spent over 15 years building power and winning change for migrants, including pioneering Canada's first sanctuary city policy and coordinating hunger strike actions in immigration detention. He's also been involved in the campaign to support Grassy Narrows First Nation in their fight for Mercury justice. And he co-founded Remember Jan 29th to combat anti-Muslim hatred after the Quebec City mass shooting in 2017. He's also in Toronto. Welcome, Hussan. Nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
And finally, Martin Lukacs is a journalist, organizer, and the managing editor of The Breach, which is the award-winning independent media outlet. He's a former environmental writer for The Guardian and was an architect of the LEAP Manifesto, which helped inspire the Green New Deal. Martin is the author of the book The Trudeau Formula, Seduction and Betrayal in an Age of Discontent. And he's written for several publications, including the New York Review of Books, Toronto Star, Walrus, and CBC. And he's joining from Montreal.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Martin. Great to have you. Our panel is complete. We are bound together for the next hour and a bit. This is a panel, we don't often have this format for webinars. It's where no one has prepared remarks today. No one has come with a carefully worded speech. We're just five folks in conversation, speaking from our experiences, speaking from our communities that we're a part of, that we're organizing within, and speaking through our lens of having been doing movement work for quite a while, in some cases, many, many decades. So I just want to kick off with a sort of big picture question. I should have sort of set a bit more context for myself. The work that I do is sort of national climate campaigning, but I also have spent the last couple of years organizing at a much more local level in Surrey, which is a heavily sort of South Asian diasporic community in BC, and building sort of organizing networks around climate issues for South Asians. And I've been finding, in that work, the last couple of years, it has been really difficult to talk about climate issues because of this sort of overwhelming mood that folks are just really, really angry at our decision makers and their the issues of affordability and of cost of living just tend to trump everything else at this point. And so things like climate justice, which are actually about survival and about economic justice, those issues are starting to be seen as sort of luxury issues or sort of nice to haves. And we saw climate drop in the polls like 14%, or even some polls say as high as 21% since the year 2000. So and the communities that I'm organizing in really feeling this sense of deep dissatisfaction without a place to really assign that discontent. And so I guess my question for you all here today is, what's the mood right now? What are you hearing from the people that you're organizing with? What are you hearing from your communities? And I guess we can kick off. It's hard to do this on Zoom, but I'm going to pass over to Laura.
Sure. So I think, I'm in a unique situation because at the OFL, we just finished doing a 11 stop tour where we were getting out into communities, and also did a virtual stop as well just last week. And so we have met with hundreds and hundreds from all corners of the province, which I think was really important to get out into communities that maybe don't typically have space provided to them to talk about these issues. And you're right, people are angry. There is a real feeling, and one of the things that we kept hearing all the time is, I haven't had a space to come and talk. And that really opened up some eyes, right? Is this idea that we do as leaders, and everybody's a leader, right? I don't think you're a leader just because you got the most votes in a particular election or because you've got the right position in an organization. Leaders are everywhere. But we have to think about how we're creating spaces for people to come together and talk about what is happening. But then the secret sauce is, what are you going to do about it, right? You need to be able to provide hope. Because it's very easy to get drawn into this quagmire of you're right. Well, I'm not going to worry about the climate change as I sit in my, apartment right now that is hotter than it ever was in July in Toronto. Climate change is real. But when I don't know when I don't know how I'm going to get food on the table, when I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent, or when I even have access to homes, when I don't know if my job is secure, when I don't know if my kids are going to have a good school to go to, if I don't know if I don't have a doctor, it is so hard to think about what does climate change mean? Or what does it mean outside of my particular what's bugging me? And so I think that, yeah, people are definitely angry. And one of the things that I think we need to do is focus where that anger belongs. On our tour, we had a lot of people blaming Trudeau for stuff that was so 100% Doug Ford. And I think there's a real need for folks to understand that, like, there are places where we can direct our anger, but even more when we build power as people, we can defeat these things. We can build an Ontario that works for everyone. We can build a Canada that works for everyone. But it's going to take us really thinking about how do we do that, and how do we maybe do it differently than we have traditionally relied on in the last 20 years.
Definitely. And you showed that with that massive strike. It was something that people didn't think was possible. And you used organizing tactics that were from a sort of previous era. And I want to return back to that. I think that's definitely something that we should talk about. But I want to extend the question and also invite our panelists just to feel free to keep your mics off mute for this conversation, because I want you to be able to jump in whenever you see fit. Hussan, I guess I would throw to you next. One of the things that we're seeing right now is a massive surge in hate towards immigrants and anti-migrant sentiment, and that's something that you're in the thick of right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we work with migrants, right? So these are farm workers, domestic workers, international students, undocumented people traditionally who are seen as not having power, not part of conversations, people who can't vote. And so what we do is we do a lot of listening. And so every second Tuesday this morning, we similarly just heard from all our organizers and our worker leaders. And, the number one thing we're hearing from people is that they need money. Right? People are unable to make ends meet. There's just not enough money to pay rent. There's just not enough money to send to families back home. There's just not enough resources. So everyone is struggling. And this, I say, is important because it's not just a migrant issue. Citizens and migrants alike, people are struggling in an economic crisis where rent is too high and it's simply not possible to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're in this moment where, yes, absolutely, migrants are being scapegoated, right, for the housing and affordability crisis. People are looking for answers, right? As Laura was saying, people are angry and they're looking to blame someone. And so what the ruling class has done is actually identified a very simple enemy, and the enemy in this case is the other, the migrant. And we know enemy shifts. Sometimes it's Muslims, as we saw in the post 9/11 moment, which I think because of Palestine is re-emerging in terms of Islamophobia. We say people have blamed homeless people have blamed disabled people have blamed unions. You find an enemy and you turn on them. And I think that is there. And I would just say this and end it, is that outside of kind of like communities and workers, what I'm also seeing and feeling a lot is a lot of cynicism and disillusionment within the progressive movement, where people really believe that, we're seeing a genocide live streamed on our phones, we're seeing a climate catastrophe, we're seeing the impossibility of all of this. And so people are just sort of saying nothing is possible. And as Laura said, it is our work to really identify hope and a credible plan to win, as I'm sure Laura would agree, and others, and actually be able to implement it in a strategic fashion, because that is deeply needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel that in organizing circles as well. A deep, for the last year, people who are doing Palestine organizing, a level of organizing that I haven't seen really in my lifetime as an organizer here in Canada. And for that to see such a lack of movement in response to that I think it's contributing to a real sense of discouragement. Judy, do you want to hop on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start from there, actually, because the work that I'm doing is mostly around Palestine. And I'm not organizing anymore. I'm too old to organize now. I'm trying to be more of an elder, And so there I want to say that you're right, Angela. That's not Anjali, right?
Anjali.
It's not the pro-Palestinian movement's the most powerful movement I've seen since the 60s, I would
Wow.
say. It feels a lot like the anti-Vietnam War movement, only better, way, way better in terms of it reflects the changes at social movements, what we've learned in social movements. I'm going to say something positive here, right? Which is like when I walked onto the U of T encampment, I felt like I died and went to heaven. Okay. Everything I fought for in my life was there. The diversity, the kindness, the love, the emotional
Oh.
intelligence. It was amazing. It really was, and it wasn't the only one. I mean, it was maybe the best one, but it wasn't the only one. And so we have a generation, a youthful generation of people who are standing up, fighting back, but the opposition is more ferocious than anything we've seen in a long time. Like there's a kind of McCarthyite attacks on people who speak out on Palestine. There's a just refusal on the part, well, in the American election, both major parties are supporting Israel. Here, at least we have the NDP who are speaking out. So at least there's one party who's speaking out for Palestine. But what's at stake here is it's revolutionary. It really is, because the US, I think the crisis is not only an economic crisis, which we have seen before, but there's an international crisis because the US, which has been able to, God knows how, sell its myth of being the purveyor of good and democracy in the world, is losing that completely now. And so is Israel. So it's a major shift internationally happening. I know people, but it's terrifying because the left is so weak. And that's the other thing I want to talk about. While the movements are stronger than we've ever seen, the political left is weaker than I've ever seen it. Like in the middle of a crisis, we're still not seeing really any major force that's speaking out about the answer is to tax the rich. The answer is to go after the rich. That's the answer here for where we're going to get money. That's where the money is, right? But is the NDP saying that? Not enough. Is anybody saying that anywhere? Not that I can see. So I think that's our problem. And it's a really serious problem because we're seeing a rise of fascism everywhere. So I think the right has managed to become very radical, while the left, political I'm talking now, the electoral left, has not radicalized at all. And that they're still sort of groping at neoliberalism. So I think that's the problem we face, and that mobilizing is important, but mobilizing is not enough. We have to challenge the political forces on the left to do better and to be more radical in what they're saying, not to focus on the mystical middle, right? That's my view, and I think a lot of people I know are very worried about what's happening. Yeah.
Judy, it's so interesting you say that. What you said about movements being stronger than ever, but the political left being weaker than ever. On Saturday, BC just had an election that is going to go down in the history books just because of like the surprising outcome. Essentially, the BC NDP, which was the party in power, had a very, very strong, looked like they had a very strong lead last year. And the BC Conservatives, which are a sort of, they were a very hollowed out party. They hadn't elected an MLA since, we call them MLAs in BC. I know I'm speaking with mostly Ontario folks. They hadn't elected an MLA since 1928, so over 100 years ago. And because of this, I'd love to hear your takes on this, but because of a combination of the sort of anger and desire for change in the air, as well as just the sort of simple error of folks thinking that these parties map onto the federal parties. And so a lot of people thought that they were supporting Poilievre by voting for the BC Conservatives, totally separate party. And so the BC Conservatives went from this completely hollowed out nothing party into surging to the top. And now we had an election that was too close to call on election night. There's going to be a bunch of recounts, and we're going to be facing a minority government situation if the NDP manages to pull through. And a lot of folks are saying that one of the things contributing the most to this is the sort of the fact that the NDP, which is supposed to be our progressive values party, really tried to pander to this mystical middle that you talk about, really tried to pander to the right. They've been sort of talking about increasing policing and involuntary treatment for drug users. They've been talking about all these sort of like, they're surging ahead with approving LNG projects. They're really using the rhetoric of the right in an attempt to appeal to those voters. And so I think what you're talking about played out here in BC just a couple of days ago. Martin, I want to throw it to you because you've written a book on this. And for those of you who don't know, Martin wrote the Trudeau formula. I think I named that in his bio. And really in this book, you argue that big L liberalism, as brought in by Trudeau, as a politics that is just as complicit in neoliberalism and created ripe conditions for the rise of a more unmasked extreme right. Yeah, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure, thank you. First of all, let me pay homage to Judy, who has a gift for appreciating whatever contemporary organizing is happening in the moment. I remember when Idle No More was happening. I remember when Occupy was happening. You were the most appreciative welcomer of these new movements. So always grateful to get your take. Yeah, I think disaffection with establishment liberals is at an all-time levels. That's clear to everyone. I think probably the most telling bookend to a decade of Trudeau in power is that we found out 2 weeks ago that income inequality in Canada has hit the highest level ever recorded. Half of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. More than 2/3 of Canadians feel that, quote, everything is broken. So it's not just Poilievre saying it. People feel it. And I think, the status quo modifying machinery of the Liberal government has offered some concessions to social movements. I would say childcare is probably the most important one that we won. But meanwhile, they have, preserved the power of corporate titans to keep guzzling record profits, accelerate colonial plunder, accelerate climate breakdown. And so, as a few people have mentioned, the moment is ripe for an answer from the left. But instead, what we've seen the right step into that vacuum. And, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, I think, are developing a very ambitious and skillful political project that I think we have to contend with. He is using a classic fake populist playbook that is not imported from the States. I really get annoyed when we hear that he's doing Trump-style politics. There's a deep wellspring of Canadian conservatives who have used this exact playbook to ride ordinary people's outrage against the establishment into office and then hand the keys to the corporate 1%. And they are building an electoral coalition that is much broader than the typical older, whiter, more rural conservative base. They are speaking to many millions, even, I would say, of people who feel screwed over. And they've made inroads with workers, with young people, with typical Green and NDP voters. And I think, I'm sure we can get into this later, but what that agenda portends for Canadians is, more of the same, but much, much worse than we've been getting with the Trudeau Liberals. And I feel that paradox that Judy mentioned, which is that I don't think have ever been in a moment where there's greater appetite for social democratic and even socialist politics in this country. But we are simultaneously in a situation where the organizing infrastructure of the progressive left is also dramatically weak. And so we, on a tight deadline, in terms of the next election, in terms of the years we have left to turn the climate ship around, have to really organize and mobilize and translate that latent progressive potential in this country into political power.
I love that. I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts on that. Laura, I'm particularly curious because you were organizing in these really unfavorable conditions where that infrastructure has been hollowed out.
I actually don't think, I think there's a way to analyze this. I think that when we talk about the mystical middle, I want to be careful that we don't talk about the mystical middle in the same way that I talk about the middle, because I think there is a mystical middle that we're watching progressive leadership try and move to the middle. But the one thing that I'm finding in organizing that we're forgetting is that we actually, as organizers, need to connect with the middle. And so when we think about what's happening right now with Pierre Poilievre, I was just at, the Canadian Labour Congress, and I said this, Pierre does not give a hoot about Laura Walton. I'm only one vote. And he knows darn well that it's not going towards him, right? Even if I lived in his riding, I'm not going to be voting in favor of the PC party. And in the same way, I'll say Doug Ford doesn't really give much of a hoot about Laura Walton. But what Pierre wants to do is get in front of workers, because why worry about the leaders of organizations? Why worry about the leaders of unions? Why worry about those people? They're just one vote. We don't have, we have a democracy in Canada and in Ontario. You vote how you wish. I have no way to make people vote. So what Pierre wants to do is get in front of workers and talk about things. And he uses really simple. If I hear axe the tax one more time, I'm going to start developing an eye twitch, right? I mean, that's the facts. But on the left, in progressive, what we often fail to do is realize that that's the crap that works, right? We have to get away from these academic kind of slogans that are long and tax the rich. Don't worry about axing the tax, put your axe away and tax the rich, right? It's that simple, keep it simple. But then figure out how we're going to get past the bureaucracy and get in front of those workers, because the employer is bringing in Pierre, the employer is bringing in Doug, the employer is bringing in John Rustad, so that they can have these moments of cool pictures and, look at the tax break that I'm going to get. And it's never going to flow down to workers. So we have to, as a movement, figure out, are we in it to win it, or are we in it to be right? Because I think sometimes we get bogged down in our righteousness on the left. And I keep reminding people, once we win, then we get to be right. Once we're in, that's when we actually start making these policies that are going to actually change the life of people. But we got to start talking to the middle. You're not going to win saying that John Rustad is a bad guy. You're not going to win saying Pierre is a bad guy. You're not going to win saying that Doug is a bad guy, because they're really kind of like, that uncle that you have sitting around the family dinner, kind of a schmuck, but everybody keeps including them. What we need to do is figure out what is bugging people, and do they realize that by voting for that, you're going to get much more of the same. It's the lather, rinse, repeat model that we've been doing. We can flip back and forth from conservative to liberal ad nauseum. If you're going to make change, you've got to make it progressively, but we do have to go out and talk to the middle, and we do have to make it so that we are making spaces that people feel that they can enter into. And I think, there is some great work happening in Toronto, but when I go outside of Toronto, what's happening in Toronto scares people outside of Toronto, because that's not their world. That's not the world that they understand. And so we have to meet those people where they are and figure out a way to bring them in. Some of the best work I'm seeing, and, Syed does this, is in Windsor, and the migrant rights work that's happening out in Windsor is fan-flippin-tastic. But we had to meet them where they are there. It doesn't look like what we do in Toronto. What we do in Niagara doesn't look like what we do in Toronto. What we do in Niagara doesn't look like what we do in Ottawa. And so really starting to find out where are those things in those areas, and then how do we bring also the mystical middle into our spaces, and so that we can move forward. Because when I talk to somebody about ensuring that kids have food at school, I've yet to meet somebody who says that's a really stupid idea. Even the most staunch conservatives are not saying to me, nope, kids should go hungry, right? So let's start there. Okay, we all agree that kids need to be fed at school. What do we need to do in order to move you along that pathway? So that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the Ontario Federation of Labour is Where do we have agreement? Let's build it from there, and then let's go up, because that's what Pierre is doing really well. That's what Doug has done very well, is finding agreement. The world is bad. The country is broken, whatever the case may be. I don't believe it. The country's not broken, but that's the story. And then he gets people signing on to that, and then he moves them along. We actually have to have a populist left that's going out and doing this work and bringing people along. The left cannot be an elite society. The left has to be opening their doors and bringing people into the places, starting where they're at. So, they may not be ready right away to be where, and like I stand on the shoulders of giants like Judy. They may not be where Judy and I are right now, right? Once upon a time, maybe Judy and I weren't where we are right now. But it's our job to start bringing people along. And, I saw that when I was doing call hubbing in BC. There was this real disconnect. And I'm like, okay, well, let's bring this back together. But it's too late to do that 2 weeks before an election. Right? If we're going to do this, we start it now. We start it now, and we've got to decide that this is what we are focusing on. This is what our goal is. And, we do have to find ways to include folks that do not have the right to vote. Some of the best organizers I know don't have the right to vote, but they can move communities like I've never seen them move communities. We need to lean into that and find out ways to bring folks along. So I do think, there's loads of ways of doing it. I do think that it's hard work, but you got to choose your hard, folks. Either we do this hard work now, or we are going to be in one hell of a mess with a hell of a lot harder world coming up.
Let me just make a quick point about how I think the right wing understands this and understands how vulnerable they are if we do exactly this kind of organizing. I attended the conservative convention in Quebec City back in the fall, and I cornered one of Poilievre's former strategists. Her name's Ginny Roth. Very smart strategist. If people want to geek out on what the right is thinking, they can read her writing on the Hub. I've been binging on right-wing podcasts and sites lately for my research. But anyways, I cornered her at the convention, and she's one of these people who uses a very effective slogan that comes from Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party: for the many, not the few. And I kind of ribbed her about that I'd been hearing her talk about that, but no one from the left really used that kind of language. And excuse me, that's my my toddler. I don't know if people can hear that. Yeah. And she she kind of accepted the ribbing and acknowledged that Poilievre's talking that way too. And she wasn't willing to cop to any kind of cynicism about it, but she did admit that the left was like missing their chance. So she traveled with Poilievre in Northern Ontario. She had been the director of communications for him during his leadership campaign. And she was ready to admit that like the swing to the right was by no means guaranteed. And she told me, and this was a quote, if they're not going to get it from a Bernie Sanders on the left, they'll take it from someone on the right.
Wow.
Yeah. So, that to me shows that they understand that we can pull the rug out from under them if we do that left populist messaging with organizing behind it. If we can activate and energize our base, if we can try to persuade and shift the center, and frankly, try to neutralize and antagonize the right. Because I don't think, as we saw in BC, as I think we're seeing in Saskatchewan right now too, the NDP is chasing votes in the middle. And voters on the right and the center don't want fake liberals. They don't want fake conservatives. But they will vote for genuine politics on the left if we embrace it.
Yeah, when I said the mystical middle, I'm not talking about ordinary people. I'm talking about the political middle. There is no political middle. That's mystical. The liberals are right wing, like they do some positive things in a social way. Most liberals are right wing. I'm not saying they're all right wing, but anyway, so what I want to say is one of the big problems with the left is it has become elitist. I agree with that. And people, and this, I see this in the Palestinian movement too, people don't want to talk to people who don't agree with them, you know, you want to write them off.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems we face right now in the on a movement level is that people don't want to have discussions with people. They just want to be with people who agree with them about everything, right? Yeah. And there's a real, like it's real, like I brought in a liberal Zionist into my class last week, and my students were like traumatized, okay? Because they're so unused to talking to someone who actually seems like quite a reasonable person, even though she's got a terrible position, in my view. But she's a good person. She is a good person. I've known her all her life, right? But she's wrong, you know? And that notion that you can be a good person and be wrong is not part of our culture anymore. It's sort of like, you know, you have to be on side on everything, right? And so we need to talk to people. And that's something the American progressive movement's a lot further along than we are. They talk about this deep organizing, and I've just come to this. You know, I'm all, like everybody knows, I started Rabble. I'm all for social media. I spend too much time in it and all that. But if you don't talk to, social media is not a place. You can organize people to get out in the streets on social media, but it's very hard to persuade people of anything on social media, right? And the best way to persuade people of something is to ask them questions about their position, right? And so that they can see themselves where they're going wrong. That's my view, is the best way. But certainly it's to talk to them. And this is a problem we have, not just social media, but COVID. People have become, like when somebody said to me, oh, I'll come over to your house. And I was shocked, you know, like whoever says I'll come over anymore, you know, like it's like we just don't, the combination of COVID and social media have really disrupted social relations. And so that's the other thing, right? So I think what you called organizing from another era, Anjali, I think we really need some of that now.
Yep. You can mobilize on social media.
What?
You can mobilize on social media. You can't organize 140 characters.
No, that's right.
This is interesting. This is an interesting conversation about the organizing tactics. I want to get to that, but I want to throw to you, Hussan, you know, just to wrap up this thread of, do we think that the majority of people are ready for a truly left offering, and trying to appeal to this mystical middle is not going to bring those folks along?
Maybe I will actually try and move to the organizing questions, because I think, you know, I'm just imagining a lot of people who are sitting here, and I, you know, maybe because I've been participated in many panels, and probably everyone's saying, well, what can I do, right? And I think so.
Yeah.
What Martin and Judy and Laura are talking about is incredibly crucial. So how does this translate into the person? So what I would say is, if you are here as somebody who mostly goes to panels and signs petitions, you need to do one step forward, right? What is that one step forward to you? Go to a rally, right? If you're someone who generally goes to a rally, the invitation is start trying to organize one. If you're somebody who donates, you donate more, right? The moment that we are in, you know, this kind of, you know, binary that I think we're all talking about, the simultaneous immiseration of our people, and the anger that is created, and the dissonance and the desperation that has emerged, while simultaneously those of us who are progressives, our cynicism has made us abandon the task. And so what I want to say to you is that we are absolutely capable of winning the justice in the worlds we all deserve. And it requires each and every one of you to take one step further. But for people who are not yet organizing, or perhaps you have been organizing, and when I say organizing, I mean go to a meeting, right? What I want to say to each and every person, where if you are kind of at that cusp, I want you to return to meetings, right? Now, I want to be very clear. Political work where you are sitting around with people, and these are not, I'm going to get to the sort of mystical middle and the middle and the others. These are still people you agree with, generally speaking, that you are beginning to organize with. Because we must first consolidate our forces before we convert the masses, and understand that these are two actual steps. So that consolidation, that going into meetings, is crucial and necessary. We have seen, as Judy's talking about, people have turned away from organizing. We wait for, we might sign petitions, we might join online events. We see even the most important kind of like thought leaders are people who are individuals. They have profiles. They're not speaking on behalf of collectives of people, which has many questions that arise around accountability. Now, I want to be clear. Organizing is difficult, messy, and painful. It is, Judy says many of the good things that you saw, but I mean, all of the bad things emerge in meetings. Like we all know that.
Yeah.
But it is the best possible option of all of the others, right? And so in those organizing, what do you do? So I encourage everyone to turn to meetings and then actually identify and wage struggles. Now, if you are in a union, go to your damn union meeting. So, you've got that covered. If you're a migrant, please join us. We will organize every migrant in the country. That is our aim and our objective and our plan. And if not, join a Council of Canadians chapter, right? Like join something and be part of the work and identify struggles that you can take that actually have a material impact on your communities, right? A lot of times we're fighting for something that is so far out there. Yes, we want to fight to stop climate change, but what does that mean in Nanaimo? What does that mean in Kelowna? What does that mean in, Sault Ste. Marie? What does that mean in, Windsor? What does it mean in St. John's? Like, what does it mean there? Fight, because political consciousness emerges through struggle. Right? So we are actually articulating our own clarity. And in that moment of organizing and when you are fighting for something is when you begin to talk to other people. And in that moment it is important to be principled, but not purist, right? Principled, but not purist. What I mean is it's not about going to speak to the ultra-rights, but it's also not about kicking people out for not having the exact correct opinion on all matters. Right? We have to identify what are the principles on the basis of which we will work with people and how are we going to move them. And then we can talk about kind of messaging and again, as I said, consolidating the forces and then converting the masses. So it is actually about very specific and discrete steps that must be taken that begin with each person sort of pushing themselves one step forward. There's 600 people here. 600 people who are in this webinar. We need 600 more people going to meetings across the country. If you folks, 600 people, were beginning to talk to 10 people, right? And those 10 people were talking to 5, those 5 were talking to 1. The scale that we have at our fingertips is immense, and it requires a focus and to do the work, right? And I think also there's been a lot of questions, right, around we are a year out from a potential Pierre Poilievre government, right? That is the sphere and I absolutely believe we can stop it. And I also believe that even if he wins, our work is not done because we are in an intergenerational fight here, right? And, learning a lot from our Indigenous communities and elders who have taught us so much is that we need to figure out how to be focused and rooted in our communities. We keep jumping from issue to issue, which we should. We need to be responsive and rooted. So if you are organizing in your community, and if you keep showing up day after day after day, people will trust you and believe you. And then, because you will show up for their struggles, I don't care whether you're fighting to put a new street light somewhere, right? Or getting a new speed bump somewhere, or trying to get that school one more teacher, et cetera, et cetera. Like whatever is the fight that makes sense, you fight it. And in that moment, or in that work, is that where we form the struggle. Because then when you go and tell people which way to vote, then when you go and tell people which union to support, then when you go and tell people don't agree to Pierre Poilievre, they're going to listen to you because you have built the trust. It's not going to happen simply because we go and start talking to the ones we don't talk to, right? You can't just go outside the choir. The choir must be hearable to the others. They must see you be in the, So I think we need to really break this down into discrete steps. And I invite everyone to even take a moment, if you're here, to think about where are you going to stretch? What are you going to do to save our planet? What are you going to do to save our future? Because the invitation and the presence of organization is our only way out.
Amazing. Thank you for taking us so firmly there. What can we do? Okay, so this is what I want to talk about because each of you is involved in, organizing that relies on that essential physical step of showing up, So this is like beyond the social media just style of mobilization. This is organizing. And the reason I said organizing from a past era, Judy, is because we don't have a lot of that anymore. Really, the Palestine organizing is, a sort of like return. I was in a church basement the other day, like a literal church basement, doing things on flip charts. And I was like, wow, this is like we just haven't had this in so long. And so, Judy, I know that you've been a part of so many victories and so many struggles that are like actual grassroots organizing over the years. So I wonder if you could speak to the importance of what Hussan was talking about.
Absolutely. Like, I think the most successful struggle I've ever been involved with is the pro-choice struggle. Okay. So when we started that, first of all, we're breaking the law. We started it by opening an illegal abortion clinic, which broke the law because that was, and we did that because Dr. Morgentaler had succeeded in doing that in Quebec. And then we organized on a whole number of levels. So we broke the law. So obviously we had a judicial fight, which is often part of our struggle. We organized. We looked at what the American women did and realized they had got the Roe v. Wade in 1973. And then they'd say, okay, that's done. Now we'll go on to something else. And the anti-choice grew. And so we knew we couldn't do that. We had to talk to people. And believe me, we talked to people. Like I was at so many churches. It's sort of ironic. So many churches during the pro-choice struggle to speak to people who were really questioning. And we didn't just ask the OFL to support us. We went to the OFL convention. We organized all the women at the convention to get up the mics and to speak about why choice was a union issue, because what the anti-choice was trying to do was not argue their position because they knew they couldn't win it, but rather it's not a union issue. It's not important to unions, it doesn't. And then we say, well, women are half the labor movement. It's a union issue, right? So we went to the places where people are and we talked them into it. And I remember having conversations with people. Don't forget, a lot of people are raised Catholic and maybe don't think about it a lot, right? But their belief is that abortion is murder because that's their religious belief. So I talked to tons of people who believed that. They weren't fanatical about it. There's no point talking to the fanatical people. You can't convince them. But people they influence, you can convince. And I think because we worked on those various levels, also in the media, which is, one thing we haven't talked about is the decline of the mainstream media, which is kind of stunning to me. I'm getting to the point I can't trust the New York Times on anything anymore. It's yeah, it's that kind of organizing. Plus, we also learned some things like I think providing service, and Hussan could probably speak to this, providing some forms of service is important too. So one of the things we did was, because the anti-choice and the cops were harassing women, we set up an escort service that volunteers who would bring women to the clinic and bring them home. And that group, which were not people who wanted to come to demonstrations like Hussan is saying, but they really were the core support of the clinic. Even though they weren't people who were going out like me and chanting and yelling, they were providing a service. And they really believed in what they were doing, right? And I still meet women who did that, right? So I think that kind of grassroots organizing is really, really important. And it's what won us. Besides the fact that we had good media spokespersons and things like that, it's what won us. You remember the Ontario NDP did not support us at the beginning. Like Bob Ray said, oh, we have to have the rule of law. He got booed off the stage in a pro-choice, one of the highlights of my life. But anyway, the pro-choice demo, he got booed off the stage for saying that, right? So yeah, so I think the pro-choice struggle, which not even Stephen Harper was a fanatical anti-choice person. I know him. Even tried to make abortion illegal again. I'm not saying, they do their reduced access, but it was a very successful struggle and it was hard fought. It wasn't easy, right? A lot, we had a lot of opposition too. And anyway, I think talking to people is really, it seems silly to say it, but it's what's missing. It's really missing.
You're talking about organizing that is so much more robust than whichever party happens to be in power at the time. Like what you just said about Harper not daring to repeal it is, you know, this kind of organizing, it sort of renders almost irrelevant who happens to be in power at the time. Yeah, fascinating. Laura, I'd love to hear your take on that. I mean, what got 55,000 people on the street?
You know, the person who stopped Mulroney from recriminalizing abortion was Pat Carney, who was central minister who brought in free trade. She was our enemy, but she was pro-choice, and she flew to Ottawa and voted against Mulroney's bill, even though she knew he was going to fire her from the cabinet, And she defeated the recriminalization of abortion. So there's an example, You never know.
I think that is it in a nutshell too, right? Like, I think sometimes that we get so caught up in like, we need to organize around one particular party. And I, you know, when we were heading into our fight, you know, I kept saying like, even if we got the most pro-labor government in tomorrow, there are going to be factions that are going to be pushing them to get what they need as well, right? Like it's always going to be there. So you have to move beyond this one fight and what's the long game in when we're doing all of this. And so I think, you know, that's like a really key thing is you can't put all those eggs in one basket. You've got to figure out talking to people who don't like you. Like that's good. That's like what we actually need to do. And, you know, I can remember having like conversations in Walmart parking lots with workers that were just furious with what we were going to do. And we were going to go on strike and blah, blah, blah. And by the end of it, you know, they were on, and some of them became some of our best organizers because they understood what it felt like to move from not in it to like, now I'm in it. Whoa. And I think those are those magical people, right? Like, and I always used to, when I would talk about organizing, I would say like typically organic leaders are the ones that drive union leaders bonkeroonies because they are in the work site, they are on your case, they're the ones that say, what is the union doing for me? But they can move workforces, they can move the lunchroom, they can move the community. Those are the people that I want first. Those are the people that I actually want to go and talk to first. The ones in the community that are making the move, even if they think that I'm like absolutely out to lunch. That's who I want to talk to first because they know how to move a community. And once we get there, they'll help you move. And I think that is so super important. And I think one of the things that when we were doing our fight in November is that it was like staying focused. There are so many people who want to get you off your game. And I think Judy makes a really good point about, you know, Roe versus Wade and okay, well then that's done. And, you know, no, like you have a lot to go. And I think that's, you know, when we talk about this bygone era, I learned about organizing from a gentleman named Andy Hussan, who was a ETFO president in my hometown. And he wrote a book called Class Action. And it talked about how prior to teachers having the right to strike in Ontario, they used to gather letters of resignation from all of the teachers. And as they went to bargaining, they would have this stack of letters from teachers who were like, either you give me what I want or I'm going to resign. And I remember thinking at the time, you can't tell me in the early 70s that life was any better for any of those teachers than it is for people right now. Right? It was a period of high inflation as well. It was a period like they had food that they needed to get on the table. They had kids, but they knew the importance of this. And it was actually what led for them to get the right to strike. And so that's one of the things that we talked about when we were building was that it's hard for you now, but it'll be hard for you later. But when you have the power of many, that is the most important force, you know. And I can remember people saying, you know, I would say to them, so what's going to happen, you know, if you go out on strike illegally? Oh, well, they may fire me. Okay, but you just told me a while ago that nobody is applying for your job, that you can't get people to come and work. So if they fire all of you, what are the chances that that's going to happen? They can't hire anyone to do your job. What are the chances that they're going to fire you? And are they going to fire an entire school? Are they going to fire an entire school board? No, they won't. But you have to find ways to get people to understand that they're part of that mass, right? So we did mass petitions. I love when Hussein said, if you've done a petition, what's your next step? So we did mass petitions so that people saw that they were part of the masses. We did photo petitions for people to start to see that they were part of it. We did t-shirts that they could wear. So when you went to work and you saw all of your colleagues were wearing the same t-shirt, oh, wait a minute, we're actually in this to win it. And what happened is that by showing those visible displays of high, majority, like super majorities, the naysayers start to go, oh, well, the movement's this way. I best get my bomb over on that side. And I think that that's like what's really super important is how are you going to show a visible display of a super majority? And what will it take to get people there? And it won't just be one conversation. It might take 5 conversations before, and it may not be Laura who can have the conversation. I might have to say, hey, Martin, I think you know this person better. Can you go have that conversation? Organizing demands that we get rid of our egos and that we get in there. It is messy. It is hard. But I'm going to say, like, that was like, I honestly, the most powerful moment of my entire life so far is when I gave my power away to every other education worker for them to do what they needed to do. And, there's something magical when you see people taking agency of what they need to do to demand what they need, not just for themselves, but for their communities, what they need for, the kids that they support or, the patients that they support. And I think the right stole that from us, right? They made us think that, you shouldn't organize. Like, oh, it's done. You got it. A court awarded it to you. Just go to sleep. And, that's why we ended up in this, kind of predicament of like people not remembering how to organize. And I think we have to also lift up Jane McAlevey, who has been taken far too soon from us. The work that she did has inspired many people to pick up, no shortcuts, to pick up raising expectations, to pick up those books and to read and to learn and to realize that you can do it. And these sorts of webinars, when you see people with common desires and you realize you're not alone, you're not wild and crazy by thinking you can demand better of your government and of your union and of your workplace. That's where the real magic gets started. And I think, you always have to ask that question though. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? I'm going to hold a rally and no one's going to show up. Okay. And that was one of the things that I had to learn along, and I still learn as the president of the OFL, not every action that we do is a winner, right? So you dust yourself off, you figure out what happened, and you move on to the next thing, right? It's definitely not a linear. It's like a spiral that we do a lot, but
I love that.
It's I think like, yeah, take a chance, get messy, go on an adventure, do some organizing, see where it's going to take you. And remember that those are the people along the way that are going to be showing up. Like showing up means everything to people. Showing up every single time. That's how you build those relationships because people will trust that you're moving in the right direction. You have to continuously show up.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So far we have, our takeaways so far: stretch yourself to take the next action, show up to the thing. And what did you say, Laura? Get messy. Don't afraid to get in there. Don't be afraid to get messy. Really concrete takeaways. I want to ask one question. We have 1 minute till I'm going to take some audience questions, but I want to follow up on one thing that Hussan, you said earlier, and then Laura also talked about. We talked about, and Martin, you also talked about the lack of infrastructure for the left to organize. You talked about building spaces for people to talk about these things together. Hussan, I correct me if I'm wrong. You talked about something happening every second Tuesday that you host. I want to talk a little bit about the infrastructure for organizing and how we can support that infrastructure to bring more people on board.
I mean, I think I'll be very short. I think we don't have a lot of spaces, right? So we have to go to historic spaces. So first, there are unions. There's a huge percentage of people in this country, probably a huge percentage of people who are sitting here. You were in a union, then you have a place to go back to as a retired worker, or if you're currently in a union, that's your infrastructure. But where that doesn't exist, there isn't a national level organizational infrastructure. I would really say Council of Canadians is one of the few things that does it. We at the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change are trying to do this for migrants because we've got, 1 in 18 people in the country doesn't have permanent resident status. These are people who are in the lowest wage jobs. These are farm workers, domestic workers, and not many people. They're not in the labor movement. They're not in the civil society movement. So, but what does infrastructure? So I would say there isn't many things. So my invitation to people is to create it, right? And you can create it simply by identifying people who are similar to you, coming together into a meeting, and then identifying a small but winnable victory that requires you to work with other people in your neighborhood, in your community. And I would invite people to do that through the council or any other structure. And in that process, develop their organizing skills, develop their consciousness. When Laura speaks about identifying organic leaders, I mean, that's a very crucial and difficult thing that we do in organizing movements. Organizing is a skill. It's not just an opinion. I think a lot of times people think about, like, what is the best message and what is the best world we want to live in? That's later. The question is actually the how. This is the nitty gritty of the work. We cook. Okay, we cook. It's not about what you want to eat, it's how to cook. So, but how do people gain that? You gain it by engaging in a struggle. So I was suggesting, fight for a new light in your neighborhood, fight for a speed bump, fight for something in your healthcare center, find something you can fight for and win, fight for, as a tenant against, rent increases, fight for something with others like you that requires you to develop the skills of how to build power. And then we can engage in the journey. And so for folks who are in organizations, I think there's a different call, right? Which is to identify how we can coalesce and find a moment of collectivity, right? Like there are moments in which we can move forward. How can we share resources and skills and strategies? Even things like photocopiers, right? I know the difficulty it is to get materials printed in many parts of this country, or like no one has a megaphone, right? Like there are lots of infrastructure gaps that we need to respond to. But I think it can be dealt with by taking whatever the next step is for people.
Grant,
The other thing is to be less worried about losing government funding. This is a big problem in women's groups now. Like women's groups always had government funding, but we didn't care, like we didn't worry about it, right? That they were going to cut our funding if we stood up against them. They did cut our funding, but we survived for a while anyway. But the point being, there's a kind of, in the NGO world, and this is totally the liberals doing this, okay, not the conservatives. This is where the liberals really screwed us, is creating this atmosphere that really we're your allies. Don't be mean to us. Don't oppose us because, you don't want to get us mad at you, But they're not really our allies. I mean, they can be, like you say, the daycare thing only took 50 years, but okay, they finally brought it in, but they're not fighting the provinces that are sabotaging it, by the way. But the liberals have really created an NGO world that is afraid to do anything that's going to rock the boat. And that's a real problem. Because when I was president of NAC, even though NAC existed so that women's groups didn't have to speak out on their own, NAC existed, right? And NAC did speak out and did fight no matter what the government said. But we don't have a lot of groups like that. I think Hussan is right that we have, the council is still doing it, Greenpeace is still doing, but other than that, there's not a lot of groups, nonprofit groups that are actually speaking out and doing stuff. And so for example, when we set up the the Anti-Free Trade Coalition, it was all big organizations, women's groups, indigenous groups, unions, all different kinds of organizations that we don't have anymore as activist groups, right? So we don't have the infrastructure. I think Martin said that. We don't have the infrastructure on the left anymore. And we have to build it. And if you look at what the Palestinian youth movement did, they built it pretty fast, right? Now, a lot of their stuff's online, right? But they were reaching out to specific communities. So we've got to build it. I think Hussan is right about that. And you can build it small and then build it up. And the council is one place where it still exists. and could move out more, I think, than they've been doing. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much. Really concrete takeaways here. So I want to jump to some audience questions. And, I'll maybe suggest someone who could start off taking the question, but really feel free to jump in, and add on. We want to hear from all of you. And so I'm gonna jump to the first question. We're going back to electoral politics here. So the question is, where does this all leave us for the next federal election? How do we beat Poilievre and the conservative premiers electorally? Can the federal and provincial NDP parties fill the progressive left populist vacuum? Sometimes supporting the NDP feels like volunteering to erase the real left. Martin, I feel like you could kick us off for this one.
Well, I feel like in about a few weeks' time, we might be in a very bizarre, surreal situation if the NDP wins in BC and the NDP wins in Saskatchewan, of having 3 non-NDP NDP governments in power in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, and BC. And so I just don't think that at the federal scene we can rely on any of the political parties, first and foremost the NDP. And I think we have to build a kind of movement populism on our own for now. The right has done such a good job at drawing those divisions along anti-establishment lines. And I think we on the progressive left have to give people a strong sense of connectedness against a common enemy. And we have to name that enemy. I think the various organizations represented here have been doing that. But I think we could get a lot better at being crystal clear about who we're up against. The oil barons, Bay Street, corporate landlords, rip-off bosses, and the media moguls who sugarcoat a rotten and rigged system. And then I think we need to tell a story about what we're fighting for as well. And I think if we're talking slogans, I still think the Green New Deal is the best slogan that we have for what we want. It has class conflict overtones built into it because it's associated with tax hikes on the rich and the corporate elite. We have to be able to tell that story to people, the story about the material benefits that come when we fight for these gains that also inevitably and simultaneously help us fight the climate crisis. The French have this great slogan, fin du mois, fin du monde, même combat. And that translates badly, as all great French slogans translate into, it's the same fight to fight the bills at the end of the month and the end of the world. And I think the truth is, I think that my own personal view is that the NDP could be a vehicle for transformative politics, but I do think that there needs to be a leadership change, and which would allow for bottom-up grassroots energy to flow into the party. Right now, the party is run by a clique of consultants who are mostly terrified about the messiness and potency of social movements. And they're just not interested. And they have, I think, belatedly noticed that Poilievre is eating their lunch by masquerading as a, faux champion of the working class. And I think they're trying their best belatedly to catch up, but it just doesn't come across as very sincere, unfortunately. And so I think we're stuck relying on ourselves for the moment. But I think we can do a lot. Like Laura was probably too modest. Like what they were able to accomplish at the education workers in Ontario, and we wrote about this at The Breach. We kind of tried to tell the story of that organizing drive. But in a year's time, they were able to do member-to-member contact and discussion with 55,000 people. And that model, the Jane McAlevey, rest in power, rest in peace, that model usually takes several years. But they were able to accomplish that organizing over a year's time. And that's about as much time as we have before the next election. So I just think it's incumbent upon us to do that work. And I do think that when when movements are strong, when the left is strong, when labor is militant, regardless of who's in power, they will shift. Certainly the case for the NDP. The Liberals also, they move whichever direction the wind blows. I mean, ultimately, their corporate masters tell them what to do, but if movements are strong, they will lean leftward. And so we have to do that work because the parties won't do it for us.
If I could just jump in, I remember this great event. This is a few years ago where the Fight for 15 was organizing, and they came here to Toronto, and they said this thing, Martin, exactly like the politicians will go whichever way the wind blows, so we must be the wind. And I think that really encapsulates a lot of what you're saying. And I think, just want to give you an example, right? Like the first article written in Canada that was published that said migrants are in any way connected to the housing crisis or unemployment or jobs, etc., was in June of 2023. Okay. From June of 2023 to sort of August to September of 2023, the Liberals were actually saying there is no connection between migrants and the housing and the affordability crisis. Today, it is unquestionable. There seems to be this massive agreement between all the political parties, even amongst progressives. Many of the people who are here will have probably been convinced that the problem is that there are too many people and not enough homes, right? Let's look at COVID-19. We go from a place where suddenly the borders are closed. Suddenly there are no flights in the sky. Suddenly you can work from your home. I mean, our people never work from home. We never closed our offices, right? But like suddenly some people can work from homes. Like there is huge kinds of changes can happen very, 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 very quickly. And so I want to say again, it is not necessary, it is not a fait accompli that Pierre Poilievre is winning. It's not a fait accompli that Trudeau is running. It's not a fait accompli. Nothing is, right? It is what we create and constitute. And so what I would also say to people is we also have to try and fight and win something from the Liberals because they still have 12 months. And if they're going to be this like lame duck party for 12 months, and if we're going into, the most important defense is offense, we need to be actually making demands on and squeezing more. I mean, I would go even further than Martin, right? Like under this NDP Liberal thing, we got pharmacare bad, childcare bad, right? Dental care bad, but like these are massive expansions in social democratic reforms. Yes, they've been doing badly. Yes, they're still cowering and to the corporate class. They could have been much better, but that was not possible. That was not possible, was not on the agenda. And in this particular moment, that's what the NDP Liberals were able to deliver in the post-COVID moment. So there is nothing saying we can't go back there, right? This is why I think the cynicism that we are all being told, Poilievre's coming, it's all negative. I get it. Like there's a genocide live streamed on our phones. It's very difficult to get up and fight. It's very difficult in the face of the massive climate catastrophe, in the rising costs of living that we are all dealing with. But I want to there's one thing anyone here can walk away with is to believe deeply in your heart that struggle produces victory, right? As Laura has taught us, as Judy told us, like there are so many examples. I work with Grassy Narrows First Nations. I mean, for 60 years, this community of 1,200 people, they had their river poisoned. They didn't stop, right? It took them like more than half a decade, but now the river will be clean. It is without the sustained ongoing work that will produce victory. And it is only that will create the momentum, as Martin was saying, to push political parties in our direction.
I love that. We have to maintain that knowledge and that hope and know that anything can change on a dime. Anything can change on a dime. I want to move to the next question. And okay, here's the question. Being very old, I can remember a time when things actually were getting better back in the 1980s or so. Welfare reforms were in process. We had co-op and nonprofit housing programs federally and provincially. But younger people don't know this and don't realize things have not always been as desperate as they are now. How can we help them learn from history? How do we give them hope to fight for better? I feel like that's connected to what you just said, Hussan, but I want to pass to Judy for this. How do we learn from history?
It's interesting because I have a student in my class And they always say I have a lot of guest speakers, and Hassan, you'll meet this person tomorrow. Every guest speaker, they say the same thing, which is, I've been working on the left, I've done that, and nothing ever changes. And finally, I got fed up and I said, okay, this class, which is 60 people, which is majority people of color, majority women, okay? I didn't say that because they can see that, but you can. I said this class, when I went to university, would be 100% white and 80% male, okay? That's when I went to university, okay? And I'm still here. I know I'm really old, but I'm still here. So we managed to change a lot, you know? And almost all of that was due to struggle, right? And so I think that's important, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that we're in about the worst situation I've ever seen. It's not like the old days. There's a massive international crisis that sort of is similar to the 30s, actually, in terms of the international crisis. But in the 30s, we had a communist movement, we had a socialist movement, and unions were really militant, right? It's like the 60s in terms of the youth uprising, right? But we don't have a strong left. So there really is, it really is tough now. And I don't think we should pretend that it's not. But yes, if we organize, we can change it. And I think that where I have my inspiration is from young people. Like, young people are amazing, like, really, because they have an emotional intelligence that we didn't have. You know, we didn't know how to support people emotionally, or, you know, give people, you know, build real collectives. You know, we didn't understand trauma, all that stuff, right? But we do now. And so we can support each other better. And I think that gives us strength that we didn't have in the 60s or 70s or even the 80s. And so, you know, I think it's going to be, it's tough, there's no question. But the other thing is, it's exciting to work for change, you know? It really feels good. And so that's the other thing. And I'm sure everybody on this call knows that. But it doesn't feel good to sit and watch, you know, a doom scroll, is that the word, right? What feels good is to go out and try and change something. Even if it doesn't succeed, you're working with other people, you're trying to, even if you don't succeed in your ultimate goal, you're going to succeed in changing some people. And it feels good. And when it feels good, more people get involved.
I love that. Laura, did you want to hop in on that as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of bring into this space. I think, you know, thank you, Hassan, for bringing up the point. Like, we've got to remember the victories. And like, I always get giggling that sometimes on the left, we do the famous, like the infamous, but it doesn't go far enough. Of course it doesn't. Nobody ever gets everything the very first time out, right? Like, it doesn't, but that's why we keep fighting, right? You get your foot in the door, and then you keep pushing, and you keep pushing. And yeah, like, I think childcare, 50 years, way too late, but it's there. But you know what? There's still a hell of a lot of a fight that we need to do around childcare, because we've got provinces that are just destroying it, you know, as quick as they can. I don't think that we can discount things like the pharmacare, the dental care, the fact that we have people that are accessing dental care for the first time. That was not done by Trudeau, folks. That was done by the NDP pushing. That was done by people like you and me pushing the NDP to do it. So like, let's not give kudos. And I say this even for myself. I don't get to carry the kudos of what we accomplished in Ontario. 55,000 people accomplished that. So, you know, let's remember that we accomplished pharmacare, we accomplished dental care, we accomplished childcare. We did that. And no, it isn't done. It isn't done, but that's why we continue to fight. I think the one thing that I would suggest to folks too is that, my God, we've got to lean in. Like, we say it all the time in union spaces. If you're mad at your union, you just don't pick up your toys and go home. You lean in, you organize, and you make sure that you're involved in the decision-making processes. You know, as we mentioned earlier, you don't like what's happening, you go to a meeting, make sure that you are participating in surveys, make sure that you're voting. I say the same darn thing about political parties. If you're not happy with what's happening at the federal or provincial level, are you a member of your riding association? Are you participating there? Are you making sure that you're becoming involved in policy conventions? Are you writing resolutions around the policies? Are you writing resolutions around platforms? Are you working with your communities to make sure that policies and platforms reflect the needs of the people that you represent? If you're not doing that, you know, politics, labor, none of this is a spectator sport. You got to get in there and you got to do. So like when I hear people, you know, say, well, I'm not happy, so I'm going to back up. When I'm not happy, that's when I lean in. If I am not there, it's probably because I'm really happy with what you're doing. And I know but if I'm there, it's probably because I know I need to use my power or use my voice or use my experience. So we got to lean in. And then I think the one thing that I would encourage people is like, we need to sometimes step out of our echo chamber and realize what's happening around us. I had the privilege just the other day to talk to the Ontario Federation of Union Retirees, a huge group of retirees that are from unions. And I said to them, you all have this wealth of experience. You led the Days of Action in Ontario. So can you explain to me why polls are showing that 50% of you are going to vote for the Conservatives? It makes no sense. It doesn't make sense that people who led what I remember as one of the most pivotal moments in labor in Ontario are now doing this. So we need to actually, as much as, you know, we say, you know, back in the 80s, it was like this, and how do we connect? We also have to realize that like we need to be thinking about who we're talking are. And if we're talking to people who agree with us all the time, I'm going to go back to it. If you find everyone in the room agreeing with you, you're in the wrong darn room. You got to go out and find the people who aren't agreeing with you and figure out how you're going to bring them in. Because like that's, I honestly, mind was blown that I would be at this meeting with these very progressive people, but the polls, the studies show that 50% of people over 60 are going to vote for Conservatives. Studies are showing, data is showing that 1 in 3 public sector workers are going to vote for Conservatives. 1 in 2 in the private sectors are going to vote for Conservatives. Sounds to me like we got a lot of conversations to have, and it means that we've got to get out of those echo chambers that we're in, that sometimes I think kind of push our hope down because we haven't gone far enough. And we need to go out and actually celebrate what we've achieved, how we've achieved it, and then get ready to go again. Because I do believe 110%, Pierre's not a foregone conclusion. Another 4 years of Doug is not a foregone conclusion. We can change that. And that's why they're pushing back. If they're yelling at you on Twitter, you're in the right way. You're going the right way.
Love that. Great note to move to the next question. This question goes back to a combination of electoral and movement politics. So the question is, what are the lessons we can learn from movements to defeat the right in other parts of the world? France recently defeated the far right by agreeing to run only one progressive candidate in each riding. Is that possible here? Martin, I might throw to you on this one.
Good question. Can I take it slightly differently and talk about the lessons we can learn from movements at home in fighting the right? Like I do think Ontario has a lot of lessons to teach. Because I think that and I hear people saying that it's not a foregone conclusion that Poilievre wins, but I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what it would mean if he did win. And the consensus I hear emerging within the Conservative Party and among kind of strategists and activists and operatives is that if they win a majority, what we have coming down the pipes is what people suffered through in Ontario during the Mike Harris days. Poilievre is someone who finds Harper too moderate. This guy is someone who has a transformative political agenda. And like happened under Harris, the moves that they will make will be fast and ruthless. And they will cut and burn and slash severely. So I do think that this is a guy who his favorite book is Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, which is the blueprint for the neoliberal revolution of the last 40 years. And it's been a shock to me that not a single journalist or pundit has picked up on this and written about it. And so, yeah, I mean, what we saw in Ontario was savage cuts to social assistance, um, you know, massive layoffs in the public. They came after the core of the public sector first, and then they came after the social programs. And I think what we saw in Ontario then was one of the biggest social movement mobilizations that has ever existed in this country. The Days of Action saw 250,000 people marching in the streets of Toronto. And while they weren't able to totally stop the agenda, they were able to constrain it in important ways. And so I do think like keeping precedents like that in mind will really help us prepare if we do have a Poilievre majority in power come the fall. We need to not, and I think this speaks to some of what we saw with the organizations that have been kind of ensnared by liberal politics. The people were like, oh, let's bid our time and see what the liberals do. Let's check out the consultations. Let's check out the blue ribbon panels and see what comes down the pipes. And what I think happened is under the Liberal government, the sections of the left and progressive left got demobilized and they were never able to pick up the fight properly again. And I think we have to be on our toes from the get-go. And so that to me is a lesson about what the kind of fight back that we need from the left with a Poilievre government. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to jump into that one?
I have a slightly different view of the Days of Action, actually, so I'm going to say it, which is what happened in the Days of Action is the union leadership didn't think they were strong enough, and they backed away from it. I'm saying this for Laura's benefit because I don't think she was around then. But the union, we organized the most powerful movement we've ever seen in Ontario, but the unions backed away from it because they didn't see immediate change. And so and we should learn from that, because if we'd continued, we would have lost a lot less. If the unions had continued in that alliance that we built, which was amazing, right across the province in every city and every town, I think we would have had a better outcome. But it is true that we haven't lost the ability to mobilize. We're mobilizing like more than I've ever seen in Toronto right now and across the country, but it's about an international issue, which is a different than mobilizing for a national issue. But still, we are mobilized. It's very grassroots. It's kind of incredible. I mean, there's really almost no big organizations mobilizing around this. They're all being super careful about it. But still, we're having masses of people. We had 30,000 people in the streets in Toronto. I think that was the biggest demonstration since the Days of Action, just a couple of weeks ago. So the young people want to do something, but we don't, and the student movement has collapsed. Everything's collapsed, right? Like the student organizations aren't as strong as it's not the student union that's organizing the Palestinian stuff. It's some other students, right? So, so I think in most places anyway, I may be wrong about that. So I think that's the thing, that we've just forgotten how to organize. And in terms of what we learned from others, like, it's really hard to see what happened in France happen in Canada. Because everybody, I mean, can you see the liberals? And I just can't see it. You know, I just can't see it. And what happened in France didn't work. I mean, it worked to defeat the right, but he still appointed a right-wing prime minister, right? So, so it didn't quite work the way that they wanted it to. And we don't have a party on the far left, you know,
No, the NDP is not insoumise. Yeah.
What? What?
But yeah, the NDP is not insoumise, you know, like with a a leader that's crystal clear about literally eating the wealthy, you know. We just don't have that. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Not to mention socialist parties that are, you know, not what they once were, certainly, but
that's right. Yeah.
We don't have those vehicles currently on the left. That could change, I think. I do think after this next federal election, I do think there will be questions to ask, questions to answer about what direction the NDP needs to go in. And I do think there are opportunities for potentially reinventing the party, questions to be asked about whether the NDP and the Greens should merge. That's something I would like to see.
I was part of an effort to do that, as you know.
I remember.
And yes, you remember. And okay, I've given up on it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you know what happened that time was what happens every time, which is, you know, there's left-right debates in the NDP and all that, but they mobilize, including getting Labour to support the right wing in the party. That's always happened. It's happened every time I fought. I mean, you can get Labour to support you on an issue inside the NDP, but when it comes to actually moving the NDP to the left, Labour has always been on the side of the ones who didn't want that to happen. So, I think that's been my experience, at least during my experience.
Yeah. I think like it's all of this, like nothing is a monolith, right? So like I think that this is stuff that we have to understand. And one of the things that, you know, I remind myself is that when I'm going out, I need to listen to learn. And so that's like, rather than listening to respond. And so that's like part of it when I'm going out and listening. I think like when we say, oh, well, the NDP or the left yet, I think we need to put the word yet in there. I don't think that everything is a foregone conclusion. We're going to throw babies out with bathwaters. Like, I think we need to talk about yet. I also don't think that Labour has its own, you know, it's got its own unique issue. But I think, you know, one of the things, and I'll say this as a Labour leader, it's a scary, lonely place too. And you get a significant amount of pressures. And I think the one thing that we all need to look around is that if we all agree collectively right now that we need to do something, because none of us want to live in a world that is ruled by Pierre Poilievre. I mean, frankly, I'm not waiting to the next election. No, he's not becoming my premier. The end. Let's do it. But I think, you know, we need to actually think about, well, if that's the case, what do we need to do to support people who are making some pretty scary decisions that maybe have not been made before too, right? So like, I totally respect that, like, people come in Labour from all different parts, right? And, you know, I often will say to the building trades, I don't care who's in government, they're always going to need the building trades because you build our provinces, you build our country. But what we need to do is move on beyond this. You always are a conservative, or you're always a liberal, or you're always an NDPer, and start talking about what does a worker look like? What does a worker government look like? And I think when we say working class, we sometimes forget that not everybody understands what a working class is, even sitting around worker spaces, even sitting around labor spaces. Not everybody understands what working class is. So we really need to talk about what does that look like? And when I say worker, you know, let's make sure that's an inclusivity. People who are unable to work, people who are undocumented workers, people who are, you know, working from home, people who are, you know, there needs to be more of those conversations too. But I think, you know, we've got to maintain, you know, some optimism. I don't believe that I do believe that we can change. I have to believe that this can change. I have to believe that, you know, my 22-year-old and my 18-year-old are far more resilient and determined and have far more grit than I ever had. And that's when I was 22 and 18 is when we were doing Days of Action. So I totally remember it, right? But just from a different context. There's so much change, but they also are demanding more change than I was. They're not happy with what's happening. They've been brought up and raised in a far more global community than what I was raised in rural Ontario. They see things in a much different, thank God, in a better light than what I was grown up in. But I really think, like, when we say, let's think about how we can craft our messages in a positive way so that we are bringing people on board. Because I think when we get into this kind of, it's not going well, it kind of scares people off, right? And they are thinking, well, if they don't have hope, then we don't have hope either. I say, let's channel some of the magical things that have happened, the hard work that's being done. Let's share where we can get into those spaces, and let's be positive. I am going to say this now. I believe that we can defeat Pierre. I believe that we can defeat Ford. I believe that we can defeat Mo. I believe that we can do this. And it's going to take defeating governments in order to achieve what we know people in Ontario and in Canada need. it's going to require that we do that. And so it is up to us to make sure that we do that. And it starts right now.
So you're saying that you believe the many can defeat the money.
Absolutely. The power of the people is always greater than the people in power. That is a mantra. We just have to keep reminding ourselves.
Just a few quick things. I know we're sort of on time soon. So just a few things. So one, right now the federal liberals have cut 775,000 study and work permits. So that's nearly 1 million people who are being excluded from the country. In US terms, because I know we're so American obsessed, that would be 7 million people suddenly being thrown out of the United States. That is a huge number of people that we are doing it, which is to say that the liberals are already implementing conservative-like policies, and this shift away from childcare, pharmacare, dental care action to conservatives is that we are not just trying to talk about defeating the conservatives, we're trying to defeat the conservative agenda, which has already been implemented. If you look, for example, globally, we can talk about defeating the right, but in Poland, the newest Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, who was the head of the EU, one of the most pro-migrant people in the EU, is now suddenly back there talking about, and Poland is now going to become the first country in the world that is no longer going to be taking asylum claimants. They're basically throwing away the Geneva Convention on Refugees put in place post-World War II, who's a progressive or a center-left kind of person, which is to say that we are, so, and I think that when we talk about this and really understand that there is an agenda, and then I agree with Martin in the sense that what is going to happen is if he wins, it is going to be awful. And we have to talk about what it means to dig our trenches. For me and in my people, we are talking about deportation and deaths. We're talking about mass exploitation and abuse. It is not an option to accept this outcome, right? We cannot. And absolutely, I agree with Martin. We must be clear, right, about how we are ready should that happen. And then we must defeat the agenda even if Pierre is in government. So the agenda must be challenged no matter what happens on that particular election day, whenever that comes. Now, I've been reading a lot of the chats and all of the Q&As, and I just want to turn this question back to many of you who are saying this. There seems to be a lot of conversation on the what. Should we have mergers, proportional representations, right? We are often talking about trying to influence politics at that massive federal level. And I want each and every one of you to really think about what your actual power is. What your actual power is and where can you actually influence decisions? Where is it that you can win materially in your communities? Because we are being, part of a demobilization is and our disorganization is that we are so used to debating the meta concepts in the big picture. How many of us are part of some NDP Green? I mean, Judy is absolutely. Martin's, an architect. But I'm sorry, like many of us will have no say on what happens over there, right? Maybe one day some of you will. So I want to invite people to really think about yourself and your power and your struggle. Organizing is in communities. Organizing is in place. Like organizing is in a structure. We can talk about how to move through one. And so really invite people to be like, how can you defeat Pierre Poilievre's agenda that might be being put in place by your school board trustee, by your municipal council, and your provincial representative, and your fucking boss, right? That agenda of mass immiseration of working class people while giving us this promises of a better world and trying to turn us into cynics has to be challenged, and we have to absolutely, I think, prepare for further disasters in a world of genocide, in a world of climate collapse, in a world of increasing fascism.
Yeah. Thank you so much for, what, I think that's a really great place to end. Those last two points in tension with and parallel to each other, the hope and the optimism and the understanding and insistence on believing that we can stop these forces, and also holding the reality of what that already means for people here right now. I just want to thank all four of you for really just being honest and bringing your full selves to this conversation and bringing your experience and sort of being able to distill so many lessons from your experience that are so concrete, actually, for all of us. I'll be really holding those concrete takeaways for myself as well. Always a good reminder, always a good refresher. We got to stretch ourselves. We got to jump in there. We got to show up, put our bodies in rooms. And I'm going to pass it over now to back to Robin and John to say a few words. But I just want to say that I'm so grateful to have shared the room with all of you.
Thanks, Anjali, and thanks everyone, Martin, Laura, Hussan, and Judy. I'm in awe to be in conversation with all of you right now, with so much history and wisdom from our movements. I'm taking a lot from this, which I'll say more about shortly. But first, I want to turn the microphone over to John Cartwright, who's the chair of the board of the Council of Canadians, to reflect for a moment on this panel. Some of you might know John. He's been with the council for decades. He was the president of the Toronto District Labour Council for years and years. He's a steadfast part of the labor movement, working to protect workers' rights and defend public systems that make our communities what they are. So John, I'd love to hear what you are thinking about at this point.
Well, I'm speaking from Toronto, the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and a space shared by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat for generations and generations. I just want to thank the panelists. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation about the challenges facing us today, and absolutely zeroing in on the question of power. As a trade unionist, I spent 4 decades helping to build a multiracial working class power to help improve the quality of life of all people, including winning a 28% wage increase for hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers, challenging systemic racism, building 3,000 permanently affordable co-op housing units. That's just one organization that did that. And negotiating thousands of green jobs. So we know that we can actually do things and win things when we work together, because that work has often been done with allies. The student movement, the anti-poverty and anti-racism groups, immigrant organizations, environmentalists, even public intellectuals, as well as minimum wage workers. And, there was a conversation about the days of action. Yep, I was head of the building trades. We shut down every construction site and we pulled 40,000 workers off the job. And earlier this year, I wrote a reminder in the Toronto Star that we've seen common sense before and it wasn't pretty. But if I go back into a construction job site today and talk about politics, I get a very different kind of answer. So our Council of Canadians was formed in 1985 at another time of troubling change to our country and our society. We were actually part of a tenacious movement challenging corporate globalization. And some people thought that was a new phenomenon, but if you look at history, it went back 4 centuries. The Dutch East India Company was the first joint stock global corporation that founded in 1602. And if you look at that history for 4 centuries, humankind has struggled to place human rights above profit and privilege, and we're still on that journey. But as people have said in the panel, in the last while, neoliberalism has managed to shrink the public imagination of what a society built on fairness could look like. So in this second quarter of the 21st century, I think we need to reclaim the vision of a world built on economic and social and racial and climate justice. Now, there's an interesting number we should think about, 18%. In 2022, that's the percentage of Canada's gross domestic product that was taken as profit, 18%. There's never been such a high share of profit taken from our economy in my lifetime. And that's what sparked the massive inflation that's angered so many Canadians. Inflation wasn't students coming from elsewhere trying to get an education, as Syed has reminded us. It was caused by corporate greed and price gouging on food, on housing, on every basic needs. 25 years ago, when we think about what we've done, 25 years ago, Canadians managed to stop the wholesale privatization of water that swept all across the US and Europe, because we built a powerful movement with Labour, the Council of Canadians, local citizens and environment groups, and we defeated water privatization in community after community across Canada. And it's a stark contrast to what was happening elsewhere. Maud Barlow and I just recently chronicled the story of Thames Water. That was the poster child of UK water privatization. It has just wiped out $1 billion from the Ontario Pension Fund OMERS. So if you're a municipal employee, $1 billion of your retirement has disappeared because of that privatization gone bad. And we talk about corporate power. So whether it's the oil men in Calgary or the speculators in Vancouver or the Bay Street financiers, they have determined they're going to fund even the most regressive kind of politics like Pierre Poilievre or in BC that's needed to take down anything that gets in the way of maximizing their profit. And what is the response we need? Well, I had an article in the Winnipeg Free Press on the Hamilton Speculator about how we could actually build Canada together. The Canada that we want, not the one framed by xenophobes waving the Canadian flag at convoy rallies or conservative politicians with their tax revolt and culture wars. We have to take this fight on around a positive vision. Every popular movement in history has framed a vision that people can believe in. And we can, engage Canadians, all Canadians in this effort, whether our families have been here 10,000 years or 10 days. We can demand the measures that were won in past decades that we kind of forgot about, like building tens of thousands of co-op and nonprofit housing units, or an experiment the steelworkers did to create a group health center in Sault Ste. Marie before we had public health care. When I look back at the history of the Council of Canadians, we fought corporate trade deals. We defended public health care and human right to water. We blocked the attempt by Stephen Harper to dramatically undermine democracy. We worked with farmers to stop GMO crops. We demanded just transition legislation to move to sustainable economy of the future. Yeah, and we fought against offshore gas and fracking. And we challenged the freedom convoy politics of division by calling for community solidarity. And last year, we launched a national campaign to help win universal, public, single-payer pharmacare for all Canadians. These are troubling times. Many people are finding it hard to find hope. But I look at the lessons of those who became before us. Before I was ever in a union, I joined the efforts to help California farm workers win worker justice. And the words "si se puede," yes we can, meant a dream of clean water and dignity in the fields. There's a plaque in Windsor that honors the efforts of auto workers, endured a months-long strike to win the first medical benefit plan for industrial workers in this country. And on that plaque, it says, when we have won healthcare for ourselves, we will never rest until all Canadians have the same. That's an expression of true social solidarity. I think of the writing of people like Art Manuel, who helped create the World Indigenous Council to bring global pressure to help dismantle Canada's colonial structures. Or usually about the words of Arundhati Roy, another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, because I'm 71 and a cancer survivor. But on a quiet day, if I listen carefully, I can hear her breathing. The lessons of our past, working with many others, is what's going to guide us as we move forward. And think about the Canada we want to build together. I hope that you'll consider joining this journey we're on, whether by being part of the Council of Canadians or working in the movements you're on, in coalition and alliances for people and the planet and democracy. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I always find it so useful to hear from folks who have been in the movement longer than I, because as we were talking about in the panel, there's so much we can learn from the past and there's so much we need to do right now. So what I want to ask the question we've all been asking, we need to organize. As Hussan named, we all need to take one step further in our organizing so we can get to this thing we're all looking for, which is addressing the many crises we're seeing today and really investing in our communities so our lives can get better. The Council of Canadians does this kind of organizing. We've been around for 40 years, organizing alongside people in community to do all kinds of things like John was just saying. And we know now, in the face of incredible power, we've got to organize. We know that. So from the Council of Canadians perspective, we need to be bringing new people into this organization so that we can be building the power that we've been talking about all evening. We need to be talking to our neighbors and friends who are not yet politically active. We need to be canvassing on the street, going to door, hearing from people, listening, inviting them into action. We need to be distributing flyers and posters in our communities so people know how to join us and that they can. We need to be writing op-eds so we can see our perspectives represented in the news. We need to be meeting with MPs and other representatives so they're not only hearing from corporate bigwigs who meet with them almost every day of the week. and we need to demonstrate in the street so that we can show what we're asking for and show that a better world is possible. And to do all of this, we need to organize people to do all of those things. So there's going to be a poll popping up in just a second. I appreciate everyone sticking around till the bitter end here. What I really want to know is, I mean, I hope you're feeling motivated. I hope you're feeling enthused, feeling some energy after this talk. What I really want to know is, what are you feeling motivated to do? What kind of action, like I was just naming, or what Hussan was pointing out earlier, what do you want to do? What's the next step for you? So if you can let us know in the poll, that would be good information to know, because we can use that to reach out to you with opportunities to get involved that align with what you're feeling motivated to do. So I'm seeing lots of questions, lots of folks answering. I see there's still a number of folks who have yet to give us a response. So I'll just invite again, if you see a little poll popped up on your screen, I'm really interested in knowing what kind of action you are interested in taking after listening to this talk and hearing all this great analysis and pointing towards our need to organize and take one step beyond where we are right now. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds for folks to answer the poll, because what you're sharing with us here, we're going to use to reach out to you with good invitations to take action that'll be interesting according to your interests. I'm going to let that poll run for a second. I see about half the people that are with us have filled it out. So I'm just going to let that roll. And while you're thinking about what kind of actions you want to take, I do want to say a second question is, have you ever donated to the Council of Canadians before? I'm really glad that we're all here tonight. I know hundreds of you have been longtime donors and supporters of the Council. We get about 90% of our funds from people like you, giving $5 or $10 or $20 a month, or by making a one-time donation when you're able to do so. So as you're thinking about what kind of action you want to take, I'm also asking if you're able to make a contribution to keep this organization growing, because we know we need to very badly grow to fill the needs, to fill the void that's left in our social movements now. So you'll see some links in the chat where you can donate. Our membership dues start at $1, and we're sustained by our monthly donors who give in an ongoing way. So I'd love to invite you to join our work. Let us know what kind of actions you want to take in the poll, so we can get in touch with you. And then if you're able, please donate now. We're gearing up for the focused, effective campaign that we've all been talking about here tonight. We know we need to change our collective futures from one that's run by corporate greed to one that's really driven by care for one another and the communities we live in. So if this is something you care about, consider giving tonight. Consider giving a bit more if you already have. We are the many. I really believe we can defeat the money, and we'll make good use of any funds that come our way to strengthen this work and this campaign. So any donations we receive tonight are going to help us put on more webinars like this with other excellent speakers to get us grooving and get us thinking. It'll help us continue to build a fight back against corporate power, and continue being a voice for investing in our communities to make sure that we can address the challenges we're facing today. The last thing I'll say is that we're going to pop a survey in the chat. If you haven't already seen it, take a look there. Should just take 2 or 3 minutes, unless you have quite a lot to say. That's okay too. It's as a little incentive to do the survey, to let us know what you thought about this evening, what we can do better, and what you're interested in doing with us. We're going to be giving away 5 tote bags, Council of Canadians tote bags. They're pretty nice. We're going to be giving away to 5 random people who fill out the survey. So do take a peek at that. And again, I'll just say thank you. I should report back on these polls. Okay, so I've seen that, wow, 147 people who are here say they have donated to the Council in the past. Thank you very much. 52 people say no, they haven't. So I'll make an invitation to all 199 people who filled out this poll. Now is a great time to continue supporting the Council of Canadians' work in any way you can, with any amount you can. So thank you, everyone. It's been really a pleasure to sit and learn with you, to hear from these different perspectives, and to talk about acting together to fight corporate power. Thanks again to all our panelists, Laura Walton, Judy Rebick, Syed Hussan, Martin Lukacs, and our moderator, Anjali Appadurai. Thanks to John for his closing words, and the many people behind the scenes who helped pull this together. And thanks to all of you for joining tonight and sticking through this conversation and through the long fight against corporate power. You'll hear from all of us again in the next couple of weeks about how to stay engaged in this fight with us. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening. So thanks so much for joining us.